Hello, everybody. This is Fun Police, and I'm back with Inscription. After finishing up the original secret guide, I ended up only doing about one video on Kaycee's mod, and then realized that there was just simply so much that was changing that all the data or anything I would have made would have just gotten outdated. However, Kaycee's mod is finally coming to its finalized state. At the time of recording, we're actually only a few days out from it becoming an official mod and pretty much being finished in terms of major changes. As such, I want to make a couple videos on some guides and some tips and tricks for people so they can see everything that Kaycee's mod has to offer. For today, we're going to take a look at all of the challenges, and I'm going to give you my suggestions on how you build each of the 12 challenge levels in order to have the easiest time completing them. Obviously, due to this, I'm going to be spoiling some stuff in Kaycee's mod. There is definitely some of the later challenges that are interesting and or have some specific stuff to them. So just if you're not looking for spoilers, maybe click off before we get around challenge level 8 or so. But otherwise, let's just jump right into it. Challenge level 1 is going to see you have 4 options to pick from. You're going to have these first 4 challenges that you can enable. You have no hook, where you do not start with the fishhook item, which is essentially from the original game, where you're able to take control of an enemy creature. You have no clover, where you're not allowed to re-roll at all. You have smaller backpack, where you only can carry 2 items, and pricey pelts, which the trapper's pelts are going to cost double what they normally do. And for the first challenge level, you just have to get 5 challenge points and beat a run with it. So that means just one of these challenges can be enabled and you're able to complete it. Talking about the challenges themselves, no hook is a relatively easy one. The hook itself is powerful, but it's a one-use item, meaning that it's only going to get you use one time in a match. So if you use it, to maybe get around an early fight, it's not that hard to just get other items that can fulfill a similar role. You have no clover, which is actually, I would say, one of the most difficult challenges in the game. On lower challenge runs, this is not that big of a deal because the challenges are not that difficult, but as you climb up the challenge levels, no clover goes from something that lowers your consistency to, and in general is just going to make you really suffer if you get bad luck. You also have smaller backpack, which is another, I think, decently challenging one. Backpack items are very powerful, and being able to have 3 of them normally is going to give you the ability to kind of build a roster of tools that you're able to dig yourself out of any situation. With only 2 items, you can find yourself running not having the correct items at the correct moment, which can really come to bite you. And then you have pricey pelts, which is actually, I would say, the easiest challenge in the game. Because you just have to not go to the trapper, this guy can essentially be a free 5 challenge points. And as such, for challenge level 1, that is my recommendation. Just simply avoid any trapper pelts and you're going to be able to very easily get challenge level 1 done by beating the game entirely with that enabled. Upon beating challenge level 1, you're going to unlock this new challenge called Boss Totems, and your new requirement will be to get 15 challenge points. This new challenge is Boss Totems. It is essentially all 4 boss battles in the game are going to have a totem enabled, increasing their difficulty. That may sound scary at first, but it actually is not that bad. As long as you understand how the bosses work, which if you're playing Kaycee's mod, hopefully you've played through the base game and you understand what each one does, you should be able to relatively work your way through it. The hardest part of this challenge, I find, is generally the final boss against Leshy, as sometimes his amalgams can become very, very powerful if they get something like double strike or the multi-strike of sigil. It can be a little bit annoying, but if you're just prepared for that, this one can actually be a pretty easy one also. Now, you do have two options here of either picking 3 of these smaller challenges or taking boss totems. I'm going to recommend taking the boss totems because it's going to give you the instant 15 points. You're going to have all these other ones, so there's no other downsides, and you're going to be pretty much going at your strongest point with just a little bit of extra challenge in the boss fights. I also recommend this because I think boss totems is actually a really good sigil to take for many of these mid-level challenges that we're going to be running into later. Once you get good at understanding, the sigils and getting better at the game, this actually does not become that big of a downside because you can adequately prepare for it. And once you do that, it can be almost kind of a free 15 points. Challenge level 2, upon being beaten, will unlock the Tipped Scales challenge. You start all battles with 1 damage on your side of the scale. Essentially, you start with -1 health, meaning that if you don't have a good start, you can end up getting killed because Leshy will be able to potentially deal that much damage and kill you. It's worth 20 challenge points, and for challenge level 3, you're going to need 30 points. As such, I do actually recommend taking Tipped Scales. Due to it being worth 20 challenge points, you can take that, and then you just have to take 2 of the 5-point challenges. I would recommend probably Pricey Pelts and the No Hook challenge. So you are going to start with a little less health, but otherwise, this is a pretty normal run. The bosses are going to be easier than the previous level, since they're not going to have totems. You still have the clover, which is very useful, and you'll have your 3 backpack slots. You could also drop Tipped Scales and go with boss totems and something like no clover, but I think overall this is going to be a harder challenge for you, and because we're so early in the challenge levels, I don't think you need to go this far. So I recommend this for level 3. Just make sure you're building your deck to have good playable turn 1 stuff. You should be getting better at deck building because you've beaten a few challenges. You'll have 3 items to protect yourself, so if you really need to, make sure to pick up rocks, or the boulders, frozen possums, and similar stuff in order to save yourself if you need to. You won't have the hook, which is usually a very strong item, but thankfully, it's a one-time use, as I talked about before, so it shouldn't be that big of a loss. Upon beating challenge level 3, you are going to unlock the All Totem Battle challenge. Essentially, all regular battles are turned into totem battles. This is actually, I think, one of the harder challenges within the game. Regular encounters can sometimes actually be already challenging enough, and the fact that all of these are going to also have totems now, I think overall makes it so you're going to probably lose some fights in regular battles, which can be a detriment both in the boss fights where you no longer get the smoke, but also puts you at risk of just dying to regular fights. The big reason I think this is a lot harder than something like boss totems is that the boss totems only come at 4 fights and you can prepare for it. However, the totem battles are much more random and also appear much more commonly. You're going to face, usually like 7 to 8 fights in a run. So you're going to deal with this almost twice as much as the boss totems. So I think overall this is a difficult challenge, and although you can try it out for certain, I'm actually going to recommend something different to get us to our 40 points. I'm going to recommend still taking Tipped Scales, taking boss totems, and taking Pricey Pelts. This gets us to the 40 challenge points that you could use. You could also take all totems and Tipped Scales, and that would get you a clean 40 points. However, I feel like having the free 5 points that Pricey Pelts essentially offers and just taking the boss totems is overall a little bit easier, but you can do it you can suit yourself either way. Once you beat challenge level 4, we're going to move on to unlock the No Boss Rares challenge. Essentially, after beating a boss, you will no longer get those special rare cards and instead just get a regular creature. It's worth 15 challenge points. It's overall one that is going to vary. You're definitely losing some power in your deck because you're not going to be able to get stuff like Mantis Gods or many of the powerful other rares that kind of exist. However, there are also a fair amount of times that the rares you're offered are essentially no better than the regular cards, so it can depend a little bit. I would say that overall, you're not going to have as many ways to completely break the game apart, but at the same time, you can also sometimes just not even feel the effect because you're still able to build very strong decks without the rares. And there are other ways to gain rares, such as through like the golden pelts from traders or certain special events. We have to get 50 points this time, and there's a couple different ways we can accomplish that. We could do something like this: tipped scales, boss totems, and no boss rares, which essentially means we're going to continue our kind of tradition of the tipped scales and boss totems, and then just simply add no rares into it, but still leaving us with clovers, a backpack. We can also now visit the trapper in order to get our rares if we really need them, so that is, I think, a legitimate option. You could also go something like this, so taking these two and doing something like this, which is going to still offer you rares and make the bosses a little easier, but you do run the challenge of the all totems, which, as I talked about, I'm personally not a fan of taking, so it can depend on you. Personally, I would probably recommend this. The reason being is that if you're doing the same challenges over and over, you get better and better at them, which makes it easier to take them as we climb up these challenge ranks. So, for example, we've taken boss totems pretty much every single time since we've unlocked it, which has made it kind of a commonplace thing. And we're hopefully, by the time you've beaten 3 to 4 runs with it, you've hopefully become pretty accustomed to it and can kind of just, take it as kind of a thing that you're just used to. Same thing with tip scales. We've run this in almost every challenge now. So we're still just able to make, a good 35 points off of this without having that much, without, having to constantly change it up and have to deal with new things. And I think that is definitely a good tip, is being consistent in what challenges you take, at least as much as possible, allows you to add a little bit more on it without overwhelming you. Upon beating challenge level 5, you're able to unlock 2 new challenges, both of them being the exact same thing of more difficult. Essentially, more and stronger opposing creatures will appear in all battles. What this means is not exactly understood completely, but essentially it means that, for example, some creatures are going to be placed with more powerful variations. A good example might be, for example, if you fight a wolf cub, it may actually just come as a straight-out wolf, being a stronger and more threatening creature without any time to respond to it. This also adds more creatures into fights, whereas normally fights may have 5 or 6 creatures in them. The more difficult sigils might add an additional 1 to 2 each. So you might end up facing 8 creatures in a regular fight before Leshy stops playing cards. These sigils do sound scary because sometimes these stronger creatures can be quite terrifying. However, they're actually not that bad in my opinion. The reason being is that oftentimes for bosses, you're looking to close the game out as quickly as possible, and the extra creatures that come from more difficult often don't have time to spawn. And the same is also true for regular fights. Generally, you want to be able to win as quickly as possible, and you should be building decks to do that. And if you're able to do that, then the more difficult sigils or challenges do not have time to really kick in and affect you. So if you're going to be playing decks that are looking to build aggressive, quick wins, these are actually are pretty manageable overall. With needing 60 points, we're actually just going to take both of these. We're still taking the boss totems, and this does mean that the boss fights are actually going to be pretty hard now, I will admit. The biggest thing being that you're not only going to have the totem, but also probably extra creatures that work with the totem. So the boss fights are something you're going to absolutely have to prepare for. Make sure you have 3 items going into it. Save your hook for a particularly nasty encounter. Make sure you're building strong decks. However, you're going to have that 5 health points that you normally start the game with. And you are also going to be missing your own rares, so your deck might not be able to find as strong of cards. If you wanted to, you could also take one of the 20-point challenges and then go with do something like this. Or you could stick with the previous challenge level 5 version and then add pricey pelts and no hook into it, completely avoiding more difficult in general. This is the same exact run, you just can't go to the trapper, so you're pretty much not going to have any rares and you won't have the hook, but otherwise it'll be a pretty normal run. I think all of those can end up working, but I actually think that this one is the best to try out, because that way you'll get accustomed to more difficult, which is something that we're actually going to be making use of for many more of these challenges, because we're starting to get to the point where we need a lot of points, and you're going to have to start taking more difficult just because it's 15 points, and it's the only way to get to the required point total. Upon completion of challenge level 6, you move on to unlock single candle, where you're limited to 1 life. Now, at first glance, this may only look to affect normal run challenges, because the boss fights always put you down to 1 life anyway. However, there's actually a small change to boss fights that can actually have some big effects. Most notably, you're not going to get the free smoke that you would if you've successfully carried a life through the match. So what that means is that you are going to essentially have 1 less sacrifice, and you don't get some free bones essentially at the start of boss fights, which can actually matter quite a lot, and it makes the single candle run kind of affect almost the entire game. And that's why it's worth 30 points, because it is a pretty big effect. It is a challenge that I actually don't usually recommend taking. Instead, we want to just take a mishmash of the other challenges in order to reach our points. It's just overall a pretty tough encounter, and being limited to a single life is just... it has a lot of downsides. One bad draw in a hand can kill a good run entirely, or sometimes the boss fights you're not able to get a good enough start in a boss fight and you fall apart. As such, I'm going to recommend that we just take the current version we have of boss totems, no rares, and then 2 more difficults, and then simply add pricey pelts and no hook on. That gets us to the 70 points we need for challenge level 7 without needing to use single candle. If you were to use single candle, we could do something like this and then take, say, pricey pelts and that. This would essentially allow us to have no totems, would continue to have rares, and we wouldn't have to take any lesser health, and that would allow us to have a pretty normal run with the one caveat of having no health. So if you want to try out new candle, I would try this, but otherwise I would probably do something like this, as I think this would be overall a little bit easier to tackle. Again, because we're still using stuff that we've already started to get accustomed to, and that way we're building ourselves to better tackle these higher challenges now. This is going to be the first time that upon beating a challenge level, we're not going to unlock a new challenge, and instead, we simply need to go on and beat challenge level 8 in order to unlock our next challenge. So we just simply need to add 10 points to something like this build. Now, there's no clean way to do this, but we could try a couple different things in order to make this doable. Notably, we could drop something like that and take the tipped scales and then add something like smaller backpack on. This would get us to 80 points. This is, I will admit, where we start getting into where you have so many options to try out that you should be able to do whatever you feel comfortable. However, I feel like we have built ourselves up over the last couple challenges that if you're following my suggestions, you're going to have pretty much no problem doing boss totems. Tip scale should be pretty familiar to you and how you play it. And then you're going to have the more difficults, which we've used for a couple times. So you're able to see and hopefully deal with any problems from that without a big deal. And then after that, we've just added on a few smaller effects. Or if you wanted to, you could keep all 3 of these off and instead go for no boss rares. This 5 set structure is something that I'm going to recommend in the future as we keep climbing up these point totals, because it's the only way to have a lot of points without taking some of the really, really hard challenges. And this is something that we still are quite familiar with without being too difficult. Again, if you feel like you don't like tip scales or you don't like one of these challenges, you can always take the all totem battles. Again, I just haven't recommended that one because I'm not a fan of it. But I think this one would probably be the one that feels most comfortable to you if you've been using this video as a guide. Upon beating level 8, we do unlock the next challenge, being Annoying Starters. Cards in the starting deck have the Annoying Sigil. The Annoying Sigil is essentially you have your creatures give enemy units facing them +1 attack. Overall, this only is going to affect your starting units, and namely, if you're playing a normal run, that means it's essentially affecting your first 3 cards, and then you're trading your 2 pelts away so they won't have the Annoying Sigil. This one is actually a pretty easy challenge to take, in my opinion. The simple fact is that it's pretty easy to usually ditch your early starter cards, and when you do that, this challenge essentially becomes nothing, because you've gotten rid of the cards that would have the downside. It's a small road bump in the early game, but overall, it's not that bad of a challenge. So I would recommend almost always taking this one. It's just a nice, easy 10 points. Just make sure to probably get rid of your starter cards. Use like the runes in order to sacrifice them and give their sigils to other cards. Although do note that will give the Annoying Sigil, so it can actually be a bit difficult to get rid of the Annoying entirely, but usually it's not that big of a downside. If you have a Mantis God and he's striking for, say, like 6 attack on turn 1, you can win games before the Annoying ever matters. But otherwise, this is a way to do it. Again, you still have some customization options. If you want to swap out tip scales for totems, you could do something like this. Or we could even take the single life, and we could do something like this, disabling the more difficult sigils. Or we could take those sigils and do something like this, which is removing that -1 life from us alongside some of these other things. There's a lot of different ways to do it. But overall, I think, again, we're still just building on the same core, and as I've said several times, I think getting used to the same challenges over and over makes it easier to add in additional effects. Beating challenge level 9 unlocks challenge level 10 alongside the Squirrelfish. Your squirrels are given the Waterborne Sigil, which essentially means they can no longer block enemy attacks. It's worth 20 points, and it's overall a challenge that is actually quite difficult. This one, I think, does ramp up the difficulty quite a lot, because you're not able to stall out some big creature anymore without spending cards that aren't squirrels. So your consistency in blocking early damage can actually go down, and it can get very difficult to work with. However, we do need to go to 100 points, so we do need to make some more revisions. If you are comfortable with this, then taking pricey pelts and no hook is a good way to reach that 100 points. And overall, gets you pretty close to what we're kind of reaching some of the hardest challenges that the game requires of you. You could also try out Squirrelfish. For example, if you wanted to disable one of the 15-point changes, like, for example, let's get rid of rares, and we can also disable no hook, we could then take the no squirrels, or the aqua squirrels, and this overall will allow you to have the 100 points needed. You're going to be able to try out that new challenge, but you're going to have rares and you're going to have the hook. I think there's a few options. And I think overall you could probably do something like this, or we could go back with the boss rares, no rares and no hook, if you feel more comfortable with what I've been suggesting previously. Now, you do not unlock a new sigil for beating a new challenge for beating challenge level 10. Instead, you just simply have to add 10 more points onto the run in order to achieve a victory. So There are many different ways to do this. We could, for example, take 2 of the 5-point challenges. This is a very easy and simple way. We could also, for example, disable some of our smaller point challenges. For example, something like the annoying starters, and then simply take the all totem battle. This one is, I think, actually quite difficult, so I would actually... It's difficult to recommend an easy run at this point. This is where the challenges really, I think, start picking up, because you're going to have to take some painful challenges in order to make this work. We could take no boss rares and the no hook, and this would get us 110. This one could be quite effective, keeping the same core plus aqua squirrels, and then the 2 easiest of the 5 points. You do have some wiggle room here to try out what you want. Take what you feel is the most comfortable to you, and then try to add what you think would be the least painful. I'll recommend this as your challenge 11 run, but it's gonna hurt. You're probably, at this point, you're definitely gonna lose some rounds. It's just gonna be a tough fight, but we know we can do it. You know, it just takes that one good run to get through it, and we're almost done. We're gonna have one more to do. Upon beating challenge level 11, we unlock easily the hardest single challenge within the entirety of Kaycee's mod. Grizzly bosses. Grizzly bosses are going to appear during all 3 of the first 3 boss battles. It's worth a monstrous 50 challenge points. It's the highest point total effect. Now, what does it mean when Grizzlies appear? Now, if you played through the original Inscription and you played to certain points during your first couple runs, the enemy would say too fast, too soon when you would beat the Angler or the Trapper in an early run, and it would spawn 8 Grizzly Bears with the Mighty Leap sigil so they block flyers. The same thing happens in this challenge. So you're having to deal with 8 Grizzly Bears immediately ready to attack you, and they block flyers. This is easily the hardest challenge within Kaycee's mod, and for a normal run, I actually do not recommend it at all. It is, I think, specifically for the people that are really looking to kick the game into high gear, because this is a significantly harder thing to deal with compared to the second phase of the normal bosses. Because that's what happens, is that the Grizzly bosses, their second phase is replaced by the 8 bears, rather than having, you know, like the Prospector destroy all your creatures and turn them into gold, or the Angler to spawn a bunch of bait buckets. The Grizzly bosses ends up doing this and replacing that, and it's significantly harder. If you do want to play with it, my tips are make sure you have your hook, make sure you have scissors, make sure you have ways to instantly kill bears, and then try to just one-shot it. That's essentially what you have to do, is you have to one-shot them instantly, unless you have something so overpowered that you can somehow deal and trade with the bears, but that's very unlikely. If you have, for example, the ink, if you've unlocked the ink and you have it, you can wipe away their sigils that would block flying, and you can fly over and kill them. But it's the biggest game-changing challenge, and overall is very, very difficult. Essentially relying on you finding some cheese and pretty much building your entire deck just to get around this. So we're not going to do that. Instead, we're taking the 110 points, and we're simply going to add annoying starters onto that. I think this is the easiest way to do 120. You can do other things. If you really wanted to do Grizzly bosses, however, I'll try to recommend the easiest ways to do it. More difficult, I think, are a good set of pairs. The Grizzly bosses don't have, like, anything after the Grizzlies, but you're not really going to be, like, outlasting the Grizzlies, so the more difficults have much less impact on that. I would probably take boss totems. Because the Grizzlies don't have any tribe, the totems are going to have less of an impact than they normally would. And then we would probably have to take something like the all totem battles. The reason being is that we don't want to take tip scales, and I don't think you want to try to be able to find rares and break the game as fast as possible. And you definitely don't want to take aqua squirrels because you want to be able to block with squirrels, maybe block a grizzly attack. But overall, this is a very hard challenge. I would say that this is significantly harder, and I would not recommend doing it if you're just trying to beat challenge level 12. Upon beating challenge level 12, you have beaten Kaycee's mod. You've unlocked all of the challenges and have done everything, and you unlock one final challenge, which is the final boss, where the final boss is replaced by a very different character. Now, it is important to note that you at this point don't have any more challenge runs. However, you do want to enable this final boss and go through a basic run. You don't have to have anything else enabled, so this is actually a pretty easy run. However, the final boss actually does get pretty much harder and demands a bit of a different thing. Most notably, I'm gonna spoil the final boss here, so if you're done with the video, I recommend skipping this part. But with that said, the final boss is a pirate captain, the one that we didn't get to fight from Grimora's encounter in the final scenario, or when the game was deleting itself. And he's actually very difficult. He starts off the phase with his phase 1 is very similar to Leshy's first encounter. However, the first thing he does is he has 2 1/8 Mole Man on the board. Compared to the normal 0/6 and singular Mole Man that Leshy has, he's got ones that can attack and also have 2 more health, and he has double them. On top of that, he's still going to be playing, the normal cards Leshy plays. However, there is also an extra phase. Upon beating him the first time, or dealing damage to him that first time, he then spawns in his second phase. He's going to pick 2 areas on the board, and after a turn, cannons will fall onto those areas and kill whatever is there, meaning that he's going to constantly be killing your own stuff, and the Mole Men will probably still be around. It's a difficult fight. However, the hardest part is his phase 3, as you're going to have to face essentially a super version of the moon. It's going to have the same properties of being able to attack all 4 lanes at once. However, it has 2 attack, and it has a monstrous 80 health, double that of the regular sigil. And as such, if you're going to take this challenge on, make sure to build your deck a little bit thicker. Have some extra creatures in there, even if they're not particularly overpowered. You need stuff to be able to block and keep trading with him, because he will wear you down if your deck is relying on like 1 or 2 cards to try to win the game for you. So you need to have your deck a little bit thicker. Otherwise, that is it for Kaycee's mod. At this point, you've unlocked everything, and you can pretty much try any combination you want. Hopefully this video has taught you, or has guided you, and maybe you found some use in my suggestions. If you did, make sure to like the video and also subscribe, because I'm going to have some other tutorials for Kaycee's mod coming up. Also, tell me down in the comments below if these, did these tips help you, or did you find them useful in any way? But otherwise, that is all I have for today. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and have a good day.